welcome all of you on behalf of the Berkeley Law Foundation and Amnesty International. I'm Rhoda Haberman, and I'm one of the co-conveners of the Bay Area Legal Support Network of Amnesty International. And I want to especially thank the Berkeley Law Foundation for inviting us to have this symposium here today. We have a fascinating and unique program today, and I don't want to spend a lot of your time, which I know is you've come to listen to Anna Hauptman and the other speakers. I want to, however, quickly tell you about Amnesty International and why we're sponsoring this program today. Amnesty International is a 25-year-old international human rights organization that's based in London. We're best known for our work on behalf of prisoners of conscience around the world, but also our mandate equally calls for opposition to the death penalty and torture wherever it might be imposed worldwide. You'll be finding the international movement of Amnesty International focusing additional and increasing attention on the United States and its practice of executions in the near future. This is the one place where our work especially impacts on this country, where there's more than 1,700 people sentenced to death. We haven't done the in-depth work that Robert Bryan has on Mrs. Hauptman's husband's case, but we feel that it exemplifies a number of things that are wrong and don't work with the death penalty. To moderate our program today, we have law professor Frank Zimbring. He is the director of the Earl Warren Legal Institute and is widely published in the field of the death penalty. He's written a book, or he's co-authored a book that's going to be coming out at the beginning of the year called Capital Punishment and the American Agenda. Mr. Zimbring.
Let me share with you my perception of the duties of moderator. At the front end of the program, which is right now, they are minimal. I want to talk for just a couple of minutes. Provide some context in the study of American criminal justice for the specific presentations of Mr. Bryant and Mrs. Hauptman, which will follow me. After their main presentations, the function of a moderator is to moderate. I will be back to field your questions, direct them appropriately, and perhaps assist in the answering of some of them if they're easy enough. But by way of a wind-up, before the main pitches of the evening, I want to say really two things. One of them is to give you a little bit of background on the linkage between Amnesty International's concerns, which are about the death penalty, and the concerns of Mr. Bryant with the Hauptman case. How is it that the specific outcome of particular trials, ancient or modern, can be linked to opposition to a particular penal regime or a particular penalty, such as death? And how is it, I think, in the case of the death penalty, has a fairly substantial pedigree in American legal studies. The movement that first drew attention in academic circles in about the 1930s in the United States, called American legal realism, was associated with the first sustained studies, not of the theory of how the criminal justice system works, but how it really in fact works. A series of scholars, including Carl Llewellyn, Judge Jerome Frank, with academic bases, and some of them high-ranking officials either in the Roosevelt administration or judges, went out and did studies, convinced that the path to appropriate reform of the institutions of criminal justice was studying those institutions and the reality of their operation. And I want to mention one book that came at the tail end of that effort, and links, I think, rather importantly to what you're going to be hearing about tonight. Near the end of an extremely distinguished career, Judge Jerome Frank, then in his late 60s or early 70s, published with his daughter, Barbara Frank, in 1957, a book that was very simply entitled Not Guilty. That was a series of studies of cases, 20th century cases that the Franks had unearthed, which they had thought had been a specific species of miscarriage of justice. People who were convicted with all of the assurances of beyond a reasonable doubt in the operation of criminal justice, who were in fact not guilty. Now, more than muckraking informed this kind of an effort late in a distinguished career by Jerome Frank, the famous American legal realist. It was his belief that the only way you can reform a system, the only way you can understand its faults, is to see it at its worst. You don't know how justice miscarries unless you study miscarriages of justice. There may be a rather obvious point in 1986. It was not an obvious point to the Academy in 1957 when it was made. It is not an obvious point in many sections of the Academy now. And yet, more than lip service, I think, is paid to the very obvious notion that the way to know how your system of criminal justice is working is to see not its theory, but its practice. I think we've made real progress there. So far, we've just been talking about general interest in miscarriage of justice, and I haven't linked it yet to the notion of opposition to the penalty of death. The linkage, I think, is both obvious and fairly forceful. It takes an enormous amount of confidence in the ultimate mission of government, in government's ability to define that mission without excess, and in the processes of fact-finding and guilt determination, before any serious penalties can be supported with confidence. It takes what is almost an arrogant endorsement of the state's means and ends before we believe that the fallible and human machinery of justice can support something as final and as irrevocable as the death penalty. For that reason, and in a much more specific tradition than just Jerome Frank's, we see modern scholars who are actively involved in opposition to the death penalty pursuing again the same kind of strategy that led to the Not Guilty book of 3 decades ago. The work, I think, that is probably most substantial that's going on in this part of this decade is that of Hugo Bedeau of Tufts University in Massachusetts and Michael Radlett at the University of Florida, I believe, again studying miscarriages of justice, more specifically convictions in cases that would have been capital cases under existing murder laws in most jurisdictions. And depending again on how you count them and what degree of reasonable doubt you're willing to entertain before you will classify something as a miscarriage of justice, and of course on whether you trust Messrs. Bedeau and Radlett, they have a rather imposing number of such nominated miscarriages of justice, which have been the subject, I think, of 2 published writings to date, and is an undertaking for publication of a major book in the next year or 2. So it is not, in a sense, socially eccentric to combine a preoccupation with the penalty of death and the fallibility of institutions of criminal justice with particular interest in miscarriages of justice or potential miscarriages of justice, which are associated with more prominent episodes in American history. And we have not only one of those episodes in our presence tonight, but living testament to its continuing importance. I think that's why you're here. I know that's why I'm here, and I'm not going to waste any more of your time in bringing our attention to that main event. Robert Bryan, who functions as an attorney in this capacity, is a San Francisco practitioner whose principal professional interest is the defense of individuals accused of capital crimes in California. He is also very active in the movement to abolish the death penalty in California and nationally, and has for the past 6 years concerned himself specially on a continuing basis with the movement to reopen the Hauptman case as a special case in his interest in his general campaign against the penalty of death. Mr. Bryan?
I want to thank the Women's Law Foundation for inviting Amnesty International to have this program tonight. We're very grateful for all of you to come out tonight. I understand Thursday night, particularly this time of year, is not the best time, particularly with exams looming on the horizon, from what people have told me tonight. What I want you to think about with me, if you will, for about the next 30 or 45 minutes, is an incredible case of injustice. It happened a long time ago, before most of us were born. My parents had not even met each other at the time of the Hauptman trial and the Hauptman execution back in the mid-30s. But there's a lot we can learn from this case today. As Professor Zemmering just indicated, he made a reference to the arrogance of the state. And I think this case dramatizes in a very eloquent way, but a very tragic way, of the arrogance of the state, and sometimes the consequences when that arrogance results in an innocent person being convicted results in loss of life. The Hauptman case is not the first case in this country in which an innocent person has been convicted. It's happened before the Hauptman case, and it's certainly happened many times since then in the intervening 50 years. It's also not the first time, nor unfortunately is it the last time, that a miscarriage of justice has resulted in an execution of an innocent person. And even those who profess to believe in the death penalty, I assume they also, though, are against executing innocent people. And maybe that's one of the points of this case, is that our system is full of imperfections. Even in a case like this, in which it appeared that the evidence was so strong against Richard Hauptman, circumstantial, but a very strong web of evidence. Now, in the hindsight of many years, and with the knowledge we have now of hidden facts, new evidence, we know that an innocent person was wrongfully executed. On the night of April 3, 1936, Richard Hauptman was in the state prison in Trenton, New Jersey. Across town from the prison was Mrs. Hauptman, his widow, sitting in the Stacy Trent Hotel on a bed in a hotel room, holding in her lap an 8x10 photograph of her husband, Richard Hauptman, who's behind me here, this photograph. That was the night Richard Hauptman was scheduled to be executed. There had already been several delays of his execution. One of the delays, they got down so close to the execution that they had even prepared him by shaving a portion of his head and slitting his trouser leg for the execution. And that night, as Mrs. Hauptman sat on that bed clutching his picture, hoping against hope that some miracle would happen and her Richard would be saved, she received word that he had been executed. The last hour of Richard's life here on this earth is well chronicled from some evidence I discovered that has not been made public. We do know that his attorneys who represented him on appeal came to his cell with the warden and explained to him that there would be no more delays, and that night he would die. We do know that shortly before his execution, he walked to the back of the cell. He asked them, "If you will give me a few moments of privacy." And they stood there looking at him in the glaring naked lights of that cell. And he knelt down on the floor, put his head almost to the concrete with his back to the warden and the attorneys. And he remained in that position about 3 or 4 minutes. And then he stood up and he turned around and he kind of got his composure and he said, "Okay, I'm ready." And they walked him to the electric chair and they killed him. Just before that, Richard Hauptman had been offered a commutation from death to life if he would simply admit that he had been involved in some manner in the kidnapping and supposed murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. He had also been offered by a newspaper chain a tremendous amount of money, even by present-day standards, if he would just admit he was involved. That money would go to his family. His response to both offers was, in essence, "I would rather not live with a lie." And so he died. Mrs. Hauptman knew her husband was innocent because he had been with her at that time, 3.5 years earlier, the night of the Lindbergh kidnapping. And what brought Richard Hauptman to that electric chair that night, and Mrs. Hauptman to that hotel room clutching her husband's picture that night, was an incredible event called the crime of the century, the Lindbergh kidnapping, which occurred March 1, 1932. By the next morning, after the Lindbergh child had been kidnapped from his home in a rural area of New Jersey, near Hopewell, New Jersey, it was not just front-page headlines throughout the country, it was headlines throughout the world, from Delhi, India, to Moscow. And it wasn't just a headline at the top of the papers. Many papers carried the whole front page, just a large picture of the Lindbergh child, with some reference to the child being kidnapped. And during the ensuing period after that, the next several months, the Lindbergh family representative, a person named Dr. John F. Condon, an elderly educator in the Bronx, negotiated with the kidnapper by a series of ransom notes, and he met with the kidnapper twice. You have to understand that this event was so big, the Lindbergh kidnapping, that people of that generation recall it and where they were when they learned of the kidnapping of the Lindbergh child, just as people, and most of us in my generation, recall where we were that day in 1963 when we learned that John F. Kennedy had been shot and he died. It was something that was etched in their memory. Mrs. Hauptman, you'll hear from her in a little while, and she'll relive with you that night. She remembers very vividly where she was and her husband was the night of the kidnapping. The go-between finally paid in behalf of the Lindbergh family in New York $50,000 to the kidnapper. Sometime after that, a body was found in a very advanced state of decomposition about 5 miles from the Lindbergh home in New Jersey. Everyone assumed it was the Lindbergh child. Lindbergh ordered that the child, the remains found, be cremated. They could not even determine the sex of the remains. But he said, I don't want a full pathological evaluation, examination of these remains. There's no need in it. Just cremate my son. And so the authorities did his bidding, and they cremated the remains. For the next 2.5 years, the authorities, not only in this country, but Scotland Yard and various police agencies throughout the globe, conducted the most intense manhunt this world had seen for the culprit. And they had no success. They ran down every possible lead. If the authorities got a call of someone who had a dream that the kidnapper was living next door, they would go look next door for the kidnapper. They checked out everything. Finally, in September of 1934, Richard Hauptman was arrested. And what led to his arrest 2.5 years after the kidnapping was the fact that Richard Hauptman possessed a portion of the Lindbergh ransom money. It was highly publicized that the authorities had the serial numbers of the money, that most of the money was what was called gold notes. The bills were yellow on one side. And after the kidnapping, they were recalled by the Roosevelt administration. And so there weren't many in circulation, only really supposedly the kidnapped money. So merchants were looking for this money throughout the United States and presumably other parts of the world. We do know now that that money had been left with Richard Hauptman by a business associate named Isidore Fish. We've learned that Fish really conned Richard Hauptman. Fish went back to Germany to visit some relatives, and he left what he called valuable papers in a sealed box with Richard Hauptman. While in Germany, Fish died. After that, some months after that, Richard Hauptman discovered that that box contained money. Fish died owing him money, and he couldn't recoup his losses, so he started spending the money, and he spent it in the neighborhood where he and Mrs. Hauptman were known. Obviously, by his conduct, as we've discovered, he had no idea that he was passing Lindbergh money with this big, intense search and with all the publicity that the authorities had the serial number of the bills. But nevertheless, when he was arrested, the authorities finally had a culprit. They finally had a good suspect after 2.5 years. And at that point in the investigation, the FBI, the New Jersey State Police, which was the principal investigating agency, the New York Police, various other law enforcement agencies were beginning to appear in the public eye like the Keystone Cops, because they could not solve this case that involved this greatest of all Americans, this living legend, this person who almost had godly proportions in the eyes of the American public, Charles Lindbergh, the man who in 1927 had flown the Atlantic solo. He was referred to as the Eagle, and the kidnapper had taken the eaglet from the eaglet's nest, and the kidnapper supposedly had killed the eaglet. And people were outraged, and they wanted somebody. And when Richard Hauptman was arrested, they had somebody. When Richard Hauptman was arrested, the Hauptmans did not have very much in the way of funds. They could not afford a good lawyer. Mrs. Hauptman tried to entice Clarence Darrow into entering the case. She approached him in Chicago. Mr. Darrow was then in the twilight of his career, and he was just too ill to take on a case of such gigantic proportions. So he had to decline, even though before the execution he sent a number of telegrams to the authorities in New Jersey stressing that the trial had been unfair and it was a travesty of justice, and this poor man should not be executed. So instead of having someone of the credibility, of the magnitude of Clarence Darrow, the Hauptmans ended up with what was offered to them. And what was offered to them was a lawyer by the name of Edward J. Riley from Brooklyn. Edward J. Riley was hired by a newspaper chain that was headquartered here in the Bay Area, had papers throughout the country.
The Hearst chain?
You guessed it. The William Randolph Hearst wanted a direct pipeline to the defense. And Hearst, as we discovered in some material we've uncovered within the past several years, sent out a directive to all of the people connected with his vast newspaper chain that they were to get Richard Hauptman, that he wanted to fan the flames of indignation against Richard Hauptman, and he wanted Hauptman to be an example for the American public of what we do to kidnappers. And this was immediately after Richard Hauptman's arrest, before anyone even knew whether there was any evidence against him, other than the fact that he was left holding the bag, had a portion of the ransom money. And so Riley was hired. Mrs. Hauptman, being, as you will notice by her accent when she speaks shortly, was a German immigrant. She was very naive. She and Richard believed that through some process, when one goes into an American court of law, it wasn't like the way it was in the Germany they had fled in the mid-1920s, with injustice, with great inflation, with high unemployment. That here in this country, what one would find in courtrooms and in our society is what the Statue of Liberty is supposed to be representing. And that in court, the truth would always come out. And they really believed that. And so when this lawyer was offered to them by someone who at the time Mrs. Hauptman did not even know was a Hearst reporter, he said, "You need a good lawyer, and I've got just a lawyer for you. This man is a crackerjack criminal lawyer. And the lawyer we have right now is not a criminal lawyer, and this man is he's magnificent." Mrs. Hauptman was very grateful that this kind gentleman was so concerned about she and her Richard. And so they accepted Mr. Riley. What they didn't know is that Edward J. Riley was known as Death House Riley, because Death House Riley had represented a number of people who had landed in the death house of New York and various other places. They also did not know that Death House Riley had a serious drinking problem. They also did not know that he was suffering at that time from the effects of a venereal disease that affected his brain. As a matter of fact, within several years after the trial, he was placed in a mental hospital because of the condition he had. They were unaware of that. They had a great lawyer. And this great lawyer went to Flemington, New Jersey, this little sleepy town where the trial was held for 6 weeks in 1935, and represented Richard Hauptman. By the time the trial began, it became center stage for the entire world. It was covered by such journalistic luminaries as Adela Rogers St. John's, Dorothy Kilgallen, Walter Winchell, Edna Ferber. They were all there to see the trial of the century. It began January 2, 1935, and ended 6 weeks later on February 13 with a guilty verdict. It became, as I said, the center of publicity for the world during that 6 weeks. It was big news. It was such big news that even by present-day standards, it is still recognized as the biggest criminal trial in the history of the United States. There's been nothing like it since. and hopefully there will not be another trial like it. During the trial, there was a lot of anti-German feeling expressed by people in the area. The town where it was tried had a population of about 2,500 people. We know that approximately 20,000 people on one particular day tried to enter the courthouse. We also know that throughout the trial, the jury could hear a mob outside chanting, "Kill the German, hang Hauptman, burn Hauptman." Richard Hauptman, being a German immigrant, with the help of the Hearst papers and some other journalistic enterprises, had been pictured as not Richard, but as Bruno, the German machine gunner. They painted him in such a way that people developed an extreme hate for him without even knowing what the evidence was. Richard Hauptman was no different in that courtroom than a black person in a charged atmosphere in which the lawyer and the judge and the jury are mostly white. And of course, the victim, alleged victim, is white. And in this case, we also had a very prominent supposed victim. The victim was not only white, Caucasian, not an immigrant, and a child of a legend, but also the victim in this case was compared with Richard Hauptman, this German immigrant, and this lovely child who was white and was more special than the rest of our society. During the trial, the Hauptmans, who did not have the funds to hire fingerprint experts and pathologists and the various other type of help that the prosecution was utilizing during the trial, were at a great disadvantage. They did have an investigator who started out on the case and who was doing a pretty good job. He came out of New York. But recently we discovered in some documents that I've uncovered that the investigator was approached by the prosecution, and this is well documented, first by a New Jersey State police officer who said, "We will pay your bill, which you're having trouble, we understand, collecting, if you will not turn over the fruits of your investigation to the defense." Then the investigator went and met with the Attorney General of New Jersey, who personally prosecuted the case and is still alive today, and his son is Chief Justice of the New Jersey Supreme Court. And the investigator, when he met with the prosecutor, the Attorney General, asked him about it. He said, "Now, I understand that you people will pay my bill when the case is over." And the prosecutor answered, "Yes, I personally guarantee it. We will pay the bill once it's all over," meaning once Hauptman is dead in the electric chair. And so the investigator went along with it. It seems like in this case, good people forgot about justice. It reminds me of something I heard someone say a while back that's very fitting, and that is, evil flourishes where good people do nothing. And it really flourished in this case. And I might just insert here that what happened in the Hauptman case, as I've already mentioned, does happen today. Normally not in prominent cases like this, but injustices occur, mistakes occur. In this case, the jury heard what appeared to be a very strong case against Richard Hauptman. They first heard Charles Lindbergh testify on the third day of the trial that the person who received the money, the voice of that person, the kidnapper who received the $50,000 ransom over 2.5 years earlier, was none other than Richard Hauptman. Seemed pretty strong. The go-between, Dr. John F. Condon, he testified that the person, the kidnapper, he met with on 2 occasions. The first time on March 12, 1932, and he sat with the kidnapper for an hour on a park bench negotiating about how much money would be paid and how the baby would be returned. And then he met with the kidnapper again on April 2, 1932, and actually paid $50,000 and talked to the kidnapper. He testified, and this is all on newsreel film footage because most of the trial was filmed. He testified very dramatically that the person he met with was, he said, Bruno Richard Hauptman. Very convincing evidence. The jury also heard from 8 handwriting experts who said the series of ransom notes passed from the kidnapper to the Lindberghs through their intermediary during the ransom negotiations, that all the notes were written by Richard Hauptman. No question about it. They said it was unrefutable that Richard Hauptman wrote the notes. There was a ladder supposedly used in the kidnapping that was placed against the Lindbergh house, which the kidnapper walked up, climbed up, and went in the window and stole the baby back in 1932. A wood expert testified that the side railing, a part of the ladder, referred to as rail 16, came from the Hauptman attic. Seemed like a real strong case, and I think maybe a normal person sitting there on the jury listening to that probably would have turned a guilty verdict. Maybe not necessarily a death verdict, but at least a guilty verdict. And of course, with the charged atmosphere and the people outside hollering, "Kill the German," and with the jury walking a gauntlet every day through the mob, as in that picture from the courthouse across the street to the Union Hotel where they were quartered. And as they walked through that crowd, the mob was jeering them, saying, "Now you've got to convict this guy, kill the German." And people had little souvenir ladders attached to their clothing, which the jury viewed as they went back and forth 3 times a day. I think it's reasonable to conclude that any normal jury would do the same thing as happened in this case. What the jury didn't know, and what we have discovered, which the government had in its own files at the time of the trial of the century, is that Richard Hauptman, according to the government's own evidence, was innocent. Not only that, we have discovered that the government had a wealth of evidence that its own witnesses for itself gave false testimony. Now, I have tried murder cases throughout this country, many of them involving the death penalty. I, as I'm sure a lot of us, have seen discrimination against minorities in the South, against minorities in the Northwest, such as Native Americans in South Dakota. I thought I had seen injustice until I got involved representing Mrs. Hauptman in our effort to clear her husband's name. And we don't have the time for me to go through everything. It would take hours for me to tell you what we found that clears Richard Hauptman, but I will give you a few examples. And maybe this will help dramatize the point that our legal system is not perfect, that it's only as strong as we who function within it, that the truth doesn't miraculously appear and happen in a court of law, and that we should not be playing God with people's lives as long as we have an imperfect system, even if some of you do support the death penalty, which I do not. Same type of thing happens today. Professor Zimmerman can tell you about it. I can tell you about it. Michael Crow, sitting back there, can tell you about it. There are plenty of people here who know of instances of this happening in modern times. Charles Lindbergh, when he testified that the voice he heard the night the ransom money was paid was that of Richard Hauptman, lied, according to the government's own files I have uncovered. I have uncovered over 34,000 pages of previously suppressed FBI documents. We have uncovered another 200,000 pages of previously suppressed state police documents in New Jersey. Last fall, we discovered another 23,000 pages of documents possessed by the governor who was in office at the time of the trial and the execution. I would say that going through all of this, I felt like a kid in a candy store, except it's been a very sad adventure going through these documents. Concerning Charles Lindbergh, he said he was sitting in an automobile about 100 yards from where the ransom money was paid that night back in 1932. The car windows were down. He heard the kidnapper holler from inside a cemetery in the Bronx, "Hey, Doc," calling to the intermediary, Dr. Condon. One time, "Hey, Doc." 2.5 years later, Lindbergh said, "No question, that's Richard Hauptman's voice." Now that seems kind of preposterous if you hear only 2 words from someone, and 2.5 years later, hear a voice and say, "That's the one." But of course, this was Charles Lindbergh. He was a living legend, and maybe he was capable of more than mere mortals. So the jury bought it. But more significant than that is that we discovered that Charles Lindbergh, 2 months before the trial, before a grand jury, and this was never made public until we got into the files, government files, in sworn grand jury testimony said he could not identify the voice. Recently we discovered that shortly after Richard Hauptman's arrest in September of 1934, Charles Lindbergh was taken to the police station in New York where Richard Hauptman was being held. He was asked to hear Richard Hauptman's voice, only Richard's. He said, "I cannot identify that voice." And yet, through some miraculous process, by the time he took the witness stand, he was completely convinced. And of course, the jury never knew of these previous inconsistencies. The prosecution sat on it, and Mr. Lindbergh did not volunteer it. Dr. Condon, the go-between, who sat down twice and talked with the kidnapper, once on March 12th for an hour on the park bench, and then later in early April of 32, he paid the man the $50,000. He is the only person who actually met with the kidnapper. His dramatic identification of the kidnapper was very faulty because we discovered that he told the authorities on a number of occasions after Richard Hauptman's arrest before the trial, "You got the wrong man. He does not even resemble the person I met with. His complexion is wrong. His hair color is wrong. His build is wrong. He is not the man. He's not even the same height." The jury never knew this. They also didn't know that Dr. Condon was considered a suspect by the authorities and that they put a lot of pressure on him. And finally, he capitulated, he gave in, and he was transformed by getting on the witness stand and identifying Richard Hauptman from a suspect to a hero in the eyes of the American public. The handwriting, we discovered that from government documents that the handwriting experts told the authorities after conducting a comprehensive investigation comparing the handwriting of Richard Hauptman with that of the kidnap notes. They said there were too many inconsistencies. This man did not write these notes. There's no way. And yet they got on the witness stand and said he did. A couple of the experts said that they were convinced Richard Hauptman wrote the notes because there were misspellings in the notes, which were identical misspellings to the way Richard Hauptman wrote. What the jury didn't know was that Richard Hauptman was told to copy handwriting samples with misspellings, and it's documented in the records. Concerning the latter, the jury wasn't told that the FBI considered that the latter, the Wood evidence, was totally preposterous, that it was not valid evidence. They didn't know that various experts had told government officials that that was concocted evidence, that there had been 8 or 9 searches of that attic of the Hauptman house after his arrest for missing wood. They found none. Then a state police officer pushed Mrs. Hauptman out of her own home, rented the house in his name, disappeared in there for several days, and then suddenly came out and found what 38 officers searching that attic never found, and that was that half of a floorboard, a very lengthy piece, was missing. And it had not been missing before. Evil flourishes where good people do nothing, and I'm sure among law enforcement there had to be some good people among the lot who were aware of this and sat on the evidence. Some of them had to be honest, I'm assuming, and maybe I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. Now, since the trial, Mrs. Hauptman has lived a very good life, but a very difficult life. A lot of people made a lot of money off the Hauptman case. They wrote books, they wrote news articles, they made movies about the case. She worked in a bakery in Philadelphia. After her husband was executed, a few years later, she moved from New York to Philadelphia. And she raised their son by herself, who now lives 2 doors from her. He's a very outstanding man. She never gave up her belief that someday something would happen to clear her husband's name. And then in 1981, our paths crossed. We got into the evidence with a lot of difficulty. It wasn't easy. It's evidence that had not been made public previously. And we discovered that not just her word that her husband was with her the night of the kidnapping, but the government in its own files had the evidence. Things like the fact that the kidnapped ladder would not even hold the weight of Richard Hauptman. He was 25 to 50 pounds too heavy. It would have broken with him. He could never have gone up it in the first place. And other things like the fact that the authorities had the fingerprints of the kidnapper, and they did not match Richard Hauptman. That was suppressed at the trial. As a matter of fact, they put on the witness stand a fingerprint expert who said in unequivocal terms that they had no good fingerprint lifts of the kidnapper, but we've got them now. And they don't match Richard Hauptman. This is stuff defense lawyers dream about having, and it was all here in the case, but the defense never knew about it. We discovered things like the fact that the defense attorney told an FBI agent during the trial that he hoped Richard Hauptman got the electric chair. Of course, he was drunk during most of the trial, and I assume he was probably drunk when he said that. I hope he was, at least. Maybe that's some excuse. What we are asking today of officials in the Northeast is to clear Richard Hauptman, to officially recognize that he did not get a fair trial and that he was innocent. This is important to Mrs. Hauptman because she's 88 as of yesterday. Her years are obviously limited. She and I are very close. We're very open about this, and she knows her days are numbered. I want, as her attorney, his name cleared while she's still alive. And the only way we can do it is through public awareness and public pressure, which I think we've generated a little bit this week since the Court of Historical Review yesterday heard the case and ruled in a very favorable manner regarding the case. We've been getting a lot of calls from the Northeast today, particularly from New Jersey. They're real upset about what we did, and it's having a very positive effect. One other thing I want to mention, and then I'm going to sit down, and I would like for you to hear from Mrs. Hauptman, who incidentally prepares no remarks. She just speaks. I don't know what she's going to say. She speaks from her heart. This is important to us, not just to clear his name and to set history right, to maybe, if you will, turn history on its head, which is where it belongs in this case. But also there's so much we can all learn from this case. It tells us so much about the death penalty. It tells us that people who are minorities, whether in the 30s when there's a lot of anti-German sentiment, they can't get a fair shake, or as a black person going to trial, or some other minority in California or Mississippi or Alabama. It tells us that normally, and I think this is true probably in 99.9% of all cases, the person who is charged capitally and ends up on death row is a poor person. I've seen people on death rows all over this country, and I've yet to meet a wealthy one. I'd like to. It would help pay the bills. Normally, they are poor. It discriminates against the poor because the poor can't hire good lawyers normally. If they're lucky, if a good lawyer is appointed in their case, more often than not, by the luck of the draw, they draw a lawyer who's not very good. We know from this case that the race and the standing of the victim is a major factor in the outcome of a case involving the death penalty. As argued several weeks ago in the McCluskey case before the Supreme Court, the study done by the professor out of Iowa, some situations, a person who is accused, a minority accused of killing a white person, is 11 times more likely to receive the death penalty than if that victim were black. And of course, in the Hauptman case, the victim was white and also the child of a very prominent couple. It seems to all be in the Hauptman case. You didn't come to hear me talk any more, I guess, than my very respected colleague, Professor Zimri. I think you came to maybe hear from Mrs. Hauptman, who, if it were not for her courage, I would not be here tonight, and we would not all be gathered. And in speaking about the death penalty, Mrs. Hauptman, that maybe if we can all learn something from this tragedy of Richard's death and what this terrible miscarriage of justice, that maybe his death was not in vain, that maybe it will serve to save future Richard Hauptmans in our society. And so I think what we're doing tonight will, I think, count for a lot about what his death meant. I think it can mean a lot to us. Mrs. Hauptman.
My husband was innocent. He never kidnapped the Lindbergh baby. He was with me the night when this terrible tragedy happened. I worked in a bakery, and that night I had to work late. It was a Tuesday. And he came to the bakery about 6:30 or so. I gave him his dinner there. And we drove home together. We went to bed. We did not even know there was a kidnapping until the next morning. When I came to work, I was shown a paper newspaper with a picture of a baby and on it. And when I read what had happened the night before. We did not even know there had been a kidnapping. And yet my husband had to die. It was just every day when he was arrested, it was like a nightmare. I just couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. The police came, the whole house upset. And I heard the policemen in my they came into the living room and they were laughing, and after that money was found, and they said, he's going to burn for that, he's going to burn for that. And I didn't know what are they saying. And it was every day like this, and they were there day or night, and I couldn't stay in the house anymore. I had to go then, and they're in the house, they were in the house. They took all our papers from our desk, letters from Fish, his partner, who brought the box in, all the letters from his mother, and my citizenship paper. They still have it. I don't know where it is, in Washington or in New Jersey. I have asked for it several times. It was never returned to me. And it went on like this, and then he was taken to Flemington, and the trial started. But we were so sure that everything would turn all right. And he said to me always, and don't worry, I'm coming home to you and to the baby. I said, I know you will. And then when we saw those people, one after the other, swear on the Bible to tell the truth, lies after lies, I looked over to my husband, he looked at me, and I think he had the same thought as I had. What will the end of this be when people lie like this? It went on like this, and finally the night came, and they found him guilty. I couldn't believe it. I had my baby with me in Flemington that night. And when I came home, I just threw myself over him. He was sleeping. And I said, we called him Bobby. And I said, Bobby, what have they done to your father? What have they done to your father? The next day we went back home to New York to my niece where I was staying. Time went on. It was not easy. I could visit him then in Flemington. And that trial was just terrible. You just wouldn't believe the mob, the people there. When I went to the courtroom in the morning, somebody almost had to help me get through on what I heard. Every day, nothing but lies and lies and lies. Well, finally, here he was found guilty, and then he came to Trenton. But whenever I visited him, he said, don't worry, and I said the same thing. When I came there, I never cried. He never saw me cry. It was very hard not to cry. But the minute I was out, I would throw myself on the bed and cry my heart out. It was the same thing all the time. But we had hopes and we had hopes. I said, God knows he saw us drive home that night. And I said, something will happen. The truth must be known. They cannot do to him what they were going to do. So finally, that night, I was in Trenton then for a few days or a week, I don't know. And then finally that night came. And the night before he died, I saw him. And that day, he had written a letter to me. the 2nd of April, and it was brought up to me to the hotel. And it was written in German, but I can translate it the best I can. And that's what it says. Dear Annie, he called me always Annie, he said. Dear Annie, your letter came in a time when I began to doubt God. But I'm ashamed of that now. Because God knows I'm innocent. He knows I did not commit that terrible crime. And he said, I don't want to believe that they want my life just to solve a case. They know that I am innocent. And I'm coming home to you, he said that night. He wrote in the letter, I know a miracle will happen. And I thought the same thing. We never said goodbye. I always said to him, Auf Wiedersehen. It means, many of you know what it means. See you next time, see you again. Well, that was the last time I saw him. And that night I was in the hotel room and a young man was with me. I don't know who he was. And I had Richard's picture and I held it so tight that he's not going to die, he's not going to die. And I listened and I looked at the door and I said, the telephone will ring, the telephone will ring, and they will tell us, no, somebody confessed to it. I waited for that ring, it never came. And then all of a sudden the man said, Mrs. Hauptman, it's all over, Richard is dead. So I sat there, and then the reporters, they came in like wild people, like animals. And I ran into the bedroom and locked myself in. And that was the end. But I swore, I took an oath on myself, and I said, I do what I can. He died, he was innocent, he never saw that Lindbergh baby, and whatever I can do, I had no money, we had nothing, but God was with me on my side, and he gave me strength to carry on. And it was not always easy. I got a job and we moved to Philadelphia. I had a friend, we grew up together in Germany, and she had a bakery. I came there and I got a job. And there I was. But then I tried. Some people said, why don't you hire a lawyer? I said, with what? If I look for an attorney, I have to show him something. I have nothing. And yet, for all those years, they had everything in there, that the proof there, and they know they had it. They know they killed the innocent man. It was not a mistake. They know. But they just want the case closed. But Richard said that book will never close. And so it was the end. And life went on. I worked, and then Mr. Pine came in my life in 1981, and he showed me some papers, and I was stunned. What is that? What is that? And I asked him if he could help in any way, and he agreed. And he said, next time when I come, I bring you some more. And he brought me some more, remember, of these papers. And when I read this, I just couldn't believe it. There was the proof. Everything was there. He had worked so hard. He worked on it long before I met him. And then I saw a little silver lining. Something is there. some good will come out of it. And all I want, I said, Richard, I fight for you. I fight for you. He was dead, but I could talk to him. He was with me every day. He's with me now for 50 years. Every day I wake up with him in my mind, go to bed and think of him. And he was with me. I worked hard. Sometimes I came home when I had night shift. 2 o'clock in the morning I walked up. I had to walk 15 minutes to the house. Was never afraid. And all my friends said, aren't you afraid at night? I said, no, I'm not afraid. Richard is here on one side and God is on the other side. So how can I be afraid? And it worked out. We even bought a house. We worked hard. My son, I raised him. He went in the army, came back again. And then you heard what Mr. Bryan said. He found out all the evidence. And they know it. They had it all in their files. The fingerprints didn't match, nothing. He was with me that night. I told the truth, and that kept me going, because I fight, and we never give up. Mr. Bryan, we never give up. We keep on fighting, and when I came here yesterday, I feel better today what we did yesterday and what the people here in your city, in your wonderful city. I met so many wonderful people. And this morning, when someone came to my door and brought me the newspaper, I said, it's just like a new beginning, a new hope. And of course, what Mr. Bryan does, Mr. Bryan does so hard, and thanks to him, without him, the case would be closed. I couldn't do a thing because I wouldn't be allowed to look in their files. I would never know. The world would never know about it. Only they know that they had all the evidence hidden there. But I can tell you my husband was innocent. And maybe dying as he did, maybe many lives will be saved. It could happen again, what they did to Richard. It can happen to others. But he died an innocent man, and I keep on fighting. I'm old now, but I still can fight because I know God is on my side. Thank you.
I would just like to say a few more words, and then Professor Zimri, I'll turn it back over to you. I mentioned earlier the Hearst newspapers, which I'm sure apparently from the reaction of some of you have heard of. It's really interesting how times change. Of course, the flagship paper of the Hearst chain today is the San Francisco Examiner. 2 days ago, on Tuesday, November the 18th, 1986, this was in the San Francisco Examiner, a big picture of Mrs. Hauptman, and an article about her fight and the innocence of her husband. I'm sure people back in the 30s would not ever have believed that day would have come. Then yesterday, we had a hearing in San Francisco, and that's what brought Mrs. Hauptman to the Bay Area. The Court of Historical Review and Appeals had a hearing yesterday at noon in the San Francisco City Hall. It's the only group we know of its type in the country. It has no legal standing, but certainly historically it carries a lot of weight. And they, in effect, retried in an abbreviated form the trial of the century. Mrs. Hauptman took the witness stand for the first time in 51 years and told about her husband's innocence. We also flew out here Hans Kloppenberg, 87, who was Richard Hauptman's best friend, the one who opened the door the night this Fish character came in with a package of papers he left with Richard Hauptman, which resulted in Richard Hauptman being inserted into this mess. The outcome of the hearing was the court determined that had the evidence I've uncovered been known, even with the hysterical atmosphere of the time, that the judge felt the evidence was so strong and so overwhelming that Richard would have walked out of that courtroom at the end of the trial an innocent man. Again, referring to the Hearst papers, I'm glad they continued writing about this case and how their interest hasn't diminished. Here's a big article from the paper this afternoon, the San Francisco Examiner. Famous verdict revised is the caption. 1936 Lindbergh trial tainted, court says. And here's a picture of Mrs. Hauptman testifying in the court yesterday with this picture of Richard behind her. So times do change. Maybe, at least journalistically, the newspapers are at least a slightly bit more responsible. Maybe the Hearst papers are trying to compensate for the damage they did back in the 30s to this family. Just a couple of other things. The professor made reference to the study by my good friends Hugo Vidot of Tufts University and Michael Radley of the University of Florida. I just happened to bring with me tonight, and I didn't know he was going to mention this, part of their study, which is a compilation of cases since 1900 in which innocent people have been wrongfully convicted, people capitally charged. The results of the preliminary study, and it's been expanded since then, establishes that approximately one person out of every 20 capitally charged in this country is innocent, people who are wrongfully convicted. This study is full of cases from California and throughout the land of innocent people who have been convicted, including also people who have paid with their lives, such as Richard Hauptman. And at the conclusion of the program, that'll be available if you would like to look at that. And finally, Mrs. Hauptman made reference to what Richard Hauptman said just before he was executed. I have here a document which I submitted yesterday to the San Francisco Court of Historical Review and Appeals. It's a 46-page summary of just some samples of the new evidence I've uncovered, which clears Richard Hauptman from government files. I concluded with some writings of Richard Hauptman just before he was executed. And he said that they think that with my death, that this case will close like a book. But he said this case will never close. In essence, the final chapter has not been written. And I think that's what we're trying to do tonight, and we tried to do yesterday in court, was to write that final chapter, and hopefully in the writing of it, as we are here tonight sharing this with you, that, as I said, we can all benefit from this tragedy, and maybe with an increased awareness that mistakes do happen in our judicial system, that maybe if the word goes out to enough people, maybe people will realize that killing people is wrong, and that we should not be playing God with other people's lives. Thank you very much for coming tonight, and if we've got time, we'd be willing to answer any questions you might have.
It's my function both to preside over the clock, and I think we do have probably about a half an hour, and to be moderate. This is not, at least in my ordinary law school experience, what I would call a linear event. And I don't know how to react precisely. One thing that would be fun if we had students here is just a kind of a compare and contrast. If you want to take 1936 and see what's the difference in the social and legal climate between 36 and 86. What kind of, what will reopening do? What kind of institutional constraints do you have? My short list of differences includes one of them, the people at journalism school will be happy to know, is investigative reporting. It didn't exist in the United States in 1936. It didn't really exist before the Kennedy assassination in the United States. What difference would it make? Plug in one there. The Freedom of Information Act, these piles of documents Mr. Bryant was talking about. Where did that happen? The Stork doesn't bring documents from federal investigators. The Freedom of Information Act is a child of the 1960s. It was 30 years before one could separate those kinds of files from investigative agencies. And that, I think, was also probably rather directly a function of the John F. Kennedy assassination and the social and political response to the Warren Commission reports around it, the climate change. Finally, there's just one legal note, and then I want to throw it open, and that is that applying a 90% discount to the prosecutorial non-disclosures that Mr. Bryant was talking about. The other change, and this one took almost 40 years, this I think took to the turn 1969, 1970, is that there is now a constitutional duty to disclose exculpatory evidence that, in spite of the fact that the prosecutor is one side of an adversary system, would have compelled the production of those documents, or at least notice of their existence, to a defense attorney, at the pain of reversal of conviction, so that even one instance of that probably would have led, I don't know what one's standard is for miscarriage of justice, but if one's standard is the reversibility of a conviction with respect to retroactivity, that probably would have done it. Well, that list could probably go on. There are questions in the audience. I don't want to stand in their way.
One thing I have noticed is in Los Angeles, I don't know the innocent or guilt of the matter, but I've been thinking that there have been quite a few parallels in the McMartin preschool case. The attorney had considerable risk to his career, dismissed charges against most of them. Do you see any parallels?
Yeah, Mr. Bryant?
Well, I definitely see parallels and between that case and the Hauptman case, which I think points out the fact that these factors which influenced and affected the tragic outcome of the Hauptman case could happen today.
I would just want to say that before you draw direct parallels, when you have a situation where something on the order of 70% of the defendants are totally dismissed from a criminal prosecution, and something on the order of 95% of the charges are removed after a preliminary hearing that lasts about
1.5 years.
Yeah, 1.5 years. That certainly is a different procedural climate than the one that I think we've been discussing here. That the problem certainly of public pressure is a chronic one, but the response of the machinery of justice, as described, stunningly.
But but the high school friend had told me that she would personally would try to see to it that the DA in that case was removed from office. That kind of atmosphere where any prosecutor who in a case where there is a public assumption of guilt will automatically people of the public will automatically try to strike back because the newspapers have assumed it. It's been not the Times but the Herald Examiner, which is the Hearst paper, and has always been one of the worst papers anywhere in the country.
Well, I think it fits the nonlinear event that we start off with what would have to be considered a nonlinear question.
I really am curious. I don't know if Robert and Brian can tell us what these calls that have come as a result of this procedure from the East. But as specifically as you can, or as generally as you can, tell us what has come and what you think will flow from this.
Well, I understand this afternoon the Attorney General of New Jersey himself, through his press aide, made a statement that he would not allow the case, the verdict would stand as is, which I thought was really very impressive that he reacted so strongly as such a high state official, which means we did get their attention, which says a lot. And I thought it's also interesting that even though we have received letters from people around the country, including New Jersey, which are very supportive, that the officials seem to speak for the people, and what they say is not the same as what the people say. We've also heard from some members of the legislature who I have approached, considering asking them to pass a proclamation or some type of bill recognizing the trial was unfair and that Richard Hauptman was innocent. We received some response from them, very favorable, that they would like to sponsor a bill. So I think hopefully a domino reaction has at least been started. And I think it's interesting that it takes a group in California to do what back in the East they should have done about 5 or 6 years ago, at least since I got in the case, they should have done.
Yes, Mr. Bryan, I was a child during that time. I remember the Lindbergh headlines very well. And even at 10 years old, I thought there was something sort of phony about the trial. I'm very glad that you came and that everything seems to be working out for you. But I have some questions for you, Mr. Bryan. Why was Dr. Condon a suspect, and who do you suspect as being kidnapped?
I was afraid I would get that question. As far as the first part, as far as Dr. Condon, shortly after the kidnapping, ran an ad, an advertisement in a paper called the Bronx Home News, which had a very limited circulation, small circulation, just in the Bronx. He offered himself as an intermediary to the kidnapper, and miraculously, the kidnapper responded immediately, and so that's how Dr. Condon was thrust into it, which is really strange and suspicious. There are a lot of strange things about the case.
He went on to become a famous heart specialist.
No, he did not. He was an elderly educator. He was not an MD. And he went on to vaudeville after this. He capitalized on this, and that's a fact.
Is he still living?
No, he died. He was in his late 70s back then. The second part of your question as to who done it, this case is more of a whodunit than anything, I think, out of Sherlock Holmes. The authorities' theories during the trial were different at the end from the beginning as to how it happened and that type of thing. I mean, even they couldn't agree on it in a court of law. We have been able to piece together, I think, an answer as to who was behind it and why it happened. I'm not prepared to comment on that yet because I am not going to comment on any aspect of the case unless I can totally nail it down 100% with facts. We're in the high 90s now, I think, but our investigation is not quite complete. We've got some loose ends to tie up, so I'd rather not speak on that. I will tell you a little bit as to some people who were not the big cheese, but who were involved under the big cheese. We have discovered in the latest batch of documents, which were the gubernatorial documents, the 23,000 pages I mentioned, that Isidore Fish, the man who left Mrs. Hauptman's husband literally holding the bag, that he was acquainted with one of the Lindbergh servants, at least one. There were 29 servants in the Lindbergh Morrow household. The Morrow was Anne Morrow Lindbergh's family. And that seemed rather coincidental. Up until that discovery, we had felt that Fish maybe just bought hot money on the street. We weren't sure. We had mixed feelings. But that ties him directly into, that's just too coincidental to ignore. So it appears that Fish was somehow involved in it, along with at least one servant.
One, two, three, four, five, 6 rows back, dark suit, red tie.
Right there.
Now, if that's a red tie, I'm going to have to be out of the service. Gentlemen.
What was the governor of New Jersey at that time? Was he concerned about
The governor of New Jersey at the time of the trial was Harold Hauptman, Hoffman, who was also in office at the time of the execution. He was Republican. He was, it was speculated that he would be a vice presidential candidate. He conducted an independent investigation between the trial and the execution because he felt, from some information he received, that the investigation had been corrupt. He had some questions as to whether or not Richard Hauptman was innocent or guilty. His independent investigation turned up some factors which we've uncovered in this latest batch of documents, which also established the innocence of Richard Hauptman. The governor took a very courageous public stand that the trial, in his opinion, had been unfair, as also the American Bar Association did. Because of the stand the governor took, his career was destroyed. He was never again elected to public office, and he died in a hotel room in New York in the 50s, early 50s. Some say suicide. It completely destroyed his career.
Yes.
Yeah, 3 questions. One, following that up, why did he issue clemency then?
The governor of New Jersey did not have the power to commute a sentence from death to life. He was a member of an executive board called a court of pardons, but it was an executive board, and it had a number of members. And even though he presided over it, he just had one vote. So he did not have the power to commute it. He could delay it, but he could not prevent it.
My other question was the jury sequestered in this trial? And the other question is, did the defense ask for or receive a copy of the grand jury testimony?
No, the defense did not have the grand jury testimony. That was not publicly known until I uncovered it a few years ago. As far as whether or not the jury was sequestered, yes, they definitely were sequestered. As you see here in that photograph on your far left, they're being led through the crowd to the hotel for their meals. They stayed in the hotel, the Union Hotel across the street from the courthouse, and they were kept together during the entire 6 weeks. But it didn't achieve really anything because they were exposed. That's where also the media was headquartered, in the hotel, and the floors above and below them. They could hear Walter Winchell broadcasting every night from the floor just above them, talking about how guilty Richard Hauptman was, that type of thing. They also heard the press and people talking about Hauptman and how strong the case was against him in the dining room. The only thing that separated them from the other diners was just a thin curtain partition in the dining area. So they were technically sequestered, but in fact, they were exposed to everything. They might as well not have been.
One other thing, at that time, a defendant did not have an automatic right to appoint counsel, right?
I'm not sure about New Jersey. Attorneys volunteered to represent Richard Hauptman, so that was not a problem. He was actually represented by 4 attorneys: Death House Riley from Brooklyn, then an attorney named Pope, another one named Rosecrans, and another one named Lloyd Fisher, who were all 3 local attorneys. This case was way over their head, but they seemed to be very sincere, and they stayed with Richard Hauptman, fought the case up through the time of the execution. They did not stand up, however, vocally or in any other way for Richard Hauptman's rights during the trial. For example, during the trial, one of the main areas of contention was whether or not the remains found were those of the Lindbergh child. Because the body was so badly decomposed, all the major organs were gone except the liver. They could not even determine the sex. The authorities could not. And so that was a real question in the case. Death House Riley conceded, stipulated that the remains found were those of the Lindbergh child. Lloyd Fisher, one of the associate attorneys, became so outraged that he went marching out of the courtroom. Hauptman was heard by the press saying, "You've just conceded me to the electric chair." Now, rather than Fisher walking out of the courtroom, I'm really glad that he was outraged over it, but he shouldn't have abandoned his client. He should have gone the other direction up to the bench, asked for a conference out of the presence of the jury in chambers with the court reporter and the judge, and demanded that either that concession be set aside or that the chief defense counsel be removed from the case. And he should have asked for his removal anyway because the attorney, as I said, was drunk and just it was a mockery the way he conducted himself.
My question is twofold. Number one, was any remains of the Lindbergh baby found? And was Mrs. Lindbergh, did she give testimony? What was it? Number three, how old was the Lindbergh baby?
All right, remains were found of the supposed Lindbergh baby. It was 20 months old at the time of the kidnapping. As I said, the remains were in an advanced state of decomposition. That was in May of 1932 when the body was found 5 miles from the Lindbergh home in a shallow grave in a wooded area. We've incidentally discovered in a recent batch of documents that that body had been planted there because in a burlap bag found near the body was a bone from the remains foot from whatever infant that was, whether it was a Lindbergh child or some other child's foot, which means it decomposed somewhere else and was transported there. Also, we've discovered that a member of a local board of a bank, board of directors, had been digging in that area right where the body was found shortly before the body was found, and he was digging boxwood plants, and of course there's no body there. There are real questions about the body. And what was your other question? You had 3. Yes, she did testify in the early part of the trial just about the events the night of the kidnapping. That was basically it.
When I was mentioning about the baby's remains, I was not including the one that you mentioned earlier about the remains that they couldn't determine what the sex was.
Yes.
I was wondering, is there any other remains that popped up in the last 50 years that maybe had any?
No, that's how I initially got involved and how I crossed paths with Mrs. Hauptman, is I initially represented a person who wasn't remains, he was alive and well, he still is, who lives in Maine, who evidence indicated might be the Lindbergh child. But that seems to be a very open question. There's evidence indicating, being totally objective, that those remains were not those of the Lindbergh child, but also an argument can be made that they were those of the Lindbergh child.
Is that, all right, is that either,
I believe you had some.
We have a general rule of one of the customer, even though it seems to be that a gloss on that rule is one of the customer can come in 3 parts.
I like to come in 3 quick parts. I operate on Ken Kerwin in Maine, and that's how I got interested in this Hauptman case. Are there any fingerprints available of the kidnapped child?
We have been looking for fingerprints since, I guess, the mid-'70s. Tony Scaduto, who wrote the book Scapegoat, published in 1976, has told me, and he may have mentioned it in his book, that he was allowed into the state police headquarters in an evidence room where they kept all this literally behind bars all these years. And he wasn't allowed to look at any documents, but just look at the ladder and so forth. And this would be around 1974, 75. He did see on top of a filing cabinet some prints. They were identified, marked as being prints of the Lindbergh infant. When I got into the evidence room some years later, there were no infant prints there, which means they had been removed, assuming that what Tony said was correct, and he is a very supposedly respected journalist. Last fall, when we discovered the governor's evidence, there were some prints found which were infant prints, but there was nothing with the prints to indicate in a file, they were glossies of them, whether or not they were those of the Lindbergh child. So we're not sure whether those were the Lindbergh child or not. They may be, they may not. We would like to be able to establish one way or the other, because that would solve the question that Kenneth Kerwin and anybody else like him might have. It would put that issue to rest if they were those of the Lindbergh child.
Do those prints match Ken Kerwin?
We don't know yet. As a matter of fact, they're in the process of being sent to a fingerprint expert.
You said you had fingerprints you found fingerprints of the kidnapper.
Yes.
Well, who was that?
We don't know. They're not Richard Hauptman's, is the point. They're not Richard Hauptman's, but we have not been able to make a positive identification. We have asked the FBI to run it through their computer to see if they match anyone from days of old, but they have not agreed to do that yet.
Now, last remark is not a question. I think you deserve a gold medal for what you're doing, Mr. Brown.
Thank you very much. And don't be shy. I might say Mrs. Hauptman doesn't mind answering questions.
I have a question for her right now.
Good.
On a slightly different note, Ms. Hauptman, I wish you could tell us a little bit about the man Richard Hauptman, and also, something personal about him. Also, I'd be curious about what your life was like the 2.5 years before before he was arrested for this crime. And also, I'd like you to develop a little bit the relationship of Mr. Hauptman with Isidore Fish.
What was the first part of the question?
I'd just like her to tell us something about the man himself, Richard Hauptman.
What kind of person? What kind of person was Richard?
He was a good husband, a loving father. Every night, when the baby was in bed, he would sit on the floor with his mandolin and played Brahms' lullaby to him. He loved his baby. He worked. He had steady work. He saved his money. He was good to me. We had a wonderful life. You couldn't ask for more. And if Isidore Fish had not come in our life, my husband would never have died.
What was the next part of the question?
Well, I was just curious what their life was like between the period of the crime happening itself and the day of his arrest.
Your life, what was it like between the time of the crime? Well, I think one thing I can comment on is this is a year before the crime. Behind Mrs. Hauptman, to her left, is a picture of Mrs. Hauptman, Richard Hauptman, and Hans Kloppenberg.
Where was it taken?
And this was taken here in the West. Now, maybe
can figure out where it is, because the sign says 8.5 miles, live your life so the undertaker will regret your loss. And if you read the rest of it, it's kind of close by, relatively speaking. It says Mount Whitney. They went on an automobile trip from New York to California in 1931, camped out all the way, and maybe you can pick it up from there, Mrs. Howe.
Yeah. We saved our money. We never belonged to anything. We saved every dollar and never had a vacation. So finally in 31, my husband had a sister in California. We had planned when we were married that we would go and see her son. And Richard had bought a car, second-hand car. And we found out that I told him, I said we had so much trouble. He almost ran someone down because the car just didn't work. So, and I said, you know what, forget about that. Get rid of that car, we don't need a car. Let's work together, save our money. But then already we could buy a car, but we didn't want to just take the money we had in the bank and just spend it for an automobile. That was luxury, this was not necessary, we wanted something behind us. So I said, let's work for a few years yet. And so we did. And then we decided that we now would make that trip to California and visit his sister. They were coming from Beverly Hills to Yellowstone Park, and we met them there. And Hans Globenburg, our friend, asked if he could, when my husband told him about his plans, he said, could I go with you? And we shared the expenses. It was wonderful. So we came all the way. I cooked, he made a trunk in the car, and opened, there was a table done. Every night, about we went, afternoon late, we went shopping, bought our things, and I cooked, and then we ate and washed the dishes, and then sat around and then made plans where we would go, how far we would drive tomorrow. And it was just wonderful. What we saw so much of that beautiful America. And so it's not that we didn't have a dollar. And what was the other question that we were saying about it?
If you could expand a little bit on the relationship also with Isidore Fish.
What about Isidore Fish?
Well, my husband met him, I was in Germany then, and he met him, and when I came back, I met him. And to me, he always seemed a little a mystery man. And my husband went into business with him, and then on and off, he would come to our house, and then they were in the room doing papers there. And Richard would tell me, well, Isidore gave me $300 or so. He sold some of the stocks, and my husband had given him invested money in that. And he said, this is the profit from what he had sold. And I thought it was just wonderful. And then we found out that he went to Germany then, and he died there. And then the brother wrote us about that his brother had told him, that Isidore Fish, the brother had told him before he died, that he had a large sum of money in America. And he said he wanted to come to America, so this money his brother worked so hard for should not go in the wrong hands. So in the meantime, Richard had found out, discovered that everything what he had told us was a lie. But he trusted him. He had nothing in his hand, only a few slips from warehouses. And when my husband went there and asked for it, he said, we never had any dealings with that man. He went to the second place, the same answer. The third address he went, it was an empty lot. It was just an empty lot. So everything he told us was a lie. And he had about $7,500 from our money. And then one day, a woman who lived in the same house where Isidore Fish lived, was a furnished room house. She said to my husband, would you come some evening in my house? I want to talk to you about Isidore Fish. Right away he went. And when he came home, I could tell bad news again, the way he came up the stairs. He was a person, he would always sing and whistle and hum and happy. And the way he walked up, so heavy step, I said, bad news again. It was bad news. And the girl said, I tell you now, Isidore Fish came to me and he said, would you do me a favor? She worked in an office and she had a typewriter at home. Would you make a few things out for me? And she said, I did that, those bills. She said, I did that, I had to do it for him. Everything was a lie.
In other words, Fish was a good con man.
Everything was a lie.
Along with a lot of other people we discovered.
And then when his brother said he wanted to come to America, then we know that we were betrayed, that we had lost everything. And then my husband said, all right. He wrote right away to him, and he said he should come. He can come. And then he said to me, when he comes, he can stay with us, and wherever he goes, I go with him, maybe through him. We found out about the money, because my husband couldn't do anything. He had nothing in his hand. In the meantime, my husband was arrested, and he came over. New Jersey had him, the brother, come over here to America during the trial, and the sister. But the prosecutor never put him on the stand. He spent thousands of dollars, yet they never put him on the witness stand.
And the prosecution at the trial did present or argue that this was kind of a story that Richard Hauptman made up, and they painted Fish as being a real nice guy. In fact, we discovered in files they concealed evidence that, in fact, they knew that Fish was a con man and had conned Richard Hauptman, and that he, in fact, was trying to recoup his losses where he'd been conned out of money by Fish.
Ladies and gentlemen, let me suggest that I don't think we're going to come to a period where interest in the case is going to flag. It's going on 20 minutes after 9. Why don't we bring the formal part of the program to a close at this point? And to the extent, I'm not really worried about Mrs. Hauptman's stamina. I'm worried about mine and Mr. Bryan's. 43 and 43 is 86. She's still got 2 on us jointly. But as much as they can stay around, I'm sure they would be willing to entertain questions. But if we could, on behalf of all the organizations that got together for this event, thank them, then we can continue this informally.
I did mention there's a book you might be interested in on this. This is the paperback and the hardback. Ervin and the Carpenter, based upon some of our findings. This was published in 1985 by Viking. The paperback by Penguin was published this year, 1986. Ervin and the Carpenter by Ludovic Kennedy, which they're quite good. They're the latest thing on the case.
Oh, God, that's enough.
Oh, and
Did you found her life the rest of those days, the day after?
do any of you know the name Clyde Tolson? His aide, who some things have come out about him. Well, Tolson, we have a lot of documents on Tolson in this case.
Well, Jago, whoever didn't believe that Hauptman did it, did he? He was sort of very questionable.
It seems to be questionable looking at the documents where they did it.
Yeah, confused.
But he never came out publicly. He never came out publicly and said,
This fellow,
And he stopped
Yeah, why don't you just turn around?
Yeah, she's faint. Oh,
Closer.
Yeah, guess what Riley asked? Are you ready? You're an attorney.
And he said, and he stopped on the sidewalk,
Dr. Lindbergh's testimony.
and he said,
One thing you would
this
not
man is innocent. The
And
government.
that ruined his career.
But see, the Jersey law, he couldn't do it. His road.
Well, J. Edgar Hoover had an awful lot of power. He was just an empire unto himself. Yes.
Could you give us more information about some of these pictures, like who these people
Yeah,
are?
what would you like?
Oh, yeah. Are you in some of them?
Yeah, she's
Yeah,
right.
she's right.
Oh, yeah, I know that one, yeah.
This is my husband. This is my husband. This man was always with him there. Day and night. He couldn't sleep without the bright light.
Who?
Oh, my husband, he never let him sleep.
Oh.
And when he came to Flemington from New York, and they had lied so much about him when he was in the Bronx. And they said he tried to commit suicide. Said Annie, she said, I want to come home. I'm coming home too. So he was very, very careful. And when he came to Flemington, he searched himself for everything. They had, something plain. And he pulled the toilet paper and the razor blade fell out. The guards outside. And he called them, he said, you come in and pick up that razor blade. I don't need it. See how they, even there they want to frame him. They thought he was clever to maybe cut himself.
And who was that man in the uniform?
It's the guard. He was always, and they brought him in, they brought my husband in like the voice criminal handcuffs. I'm sure. It was terrible.
Are these his lawyers or
The attorney?
No. These are all from the state. Those men are reporters. Yes, my husband is the guard. He was always.
That's you?
Yeah.
How many times were you called to the witness stand?
Only once.
Only just the one,
Yeah.
to testify that you were
During the
with your
Oh,
husband
yeah.
that night.
Yeah.
Do you have a positive feeling towards the governor at that time that he might have understood the truth of what went on? Or the governor of New Jersey at that
Governor
time?
Hauptman. Oh, he believed. Oh, yes, he believed. He knows he was innocent. But they have that law, they call it Jersey law. It's a very bad law.
I'm sorry you had to go through so much
But
stuff.
we still hope to the last minute, to the last second. I said something will happen. I cannot die because I know it was me.
Sounds like some positive things are happening now. So
And he was a good person. And this year, he said, we avoid, and we saved down when we had these money. That's when we made the trip. For 3 months, we were away, all through to the west, And this was before we entered the valley, when we went to that valley. We took that picture. And it's not so good of me because I had
Well, I've only read the first couple of
what's a plane with the biggest things in it? And you say that it hurts. And I sit still
It's mixed.
He will have the camera and hands. He would set a camera and then he ran out before he was in the picture too.
Who's this back?
Happy belated Saturday. He was here today. Oh, yesterday he testified. He said he said yes. He was more than my brother.
Who's the man in the uniform?
A guard.
That looks like a Nazi uniform.
Yes.
It looks like Himmler.
It does.
No, there's no lawyer. No. I think I've seen him here.
Has Mrs. Limburg ever contacted
No,
said anything?
we wrote a letter 2 years ago. And I asked her in the letter if she would see me. I wanted to stand before her and tell her, Mrs. Linda, believe me, my husband did not kidnap your baby. And he didn't get her in. We invited her even, did give her notice that what was going on yesterday here. And so she knew all about it. I cried for that baby, I prayed for that baby, I remember so well. And I said to a friend of mine, I said, I'm not a Catholic, but I know the Catholic Church, I go often in Catholic Church too. But I know they are open every day. You know, the doors are open, you can go in all day. And I remember so well when this happened, and I said to my husband, if only somebody would wrap that baby in a warm blanket and go in a Catholic church and put it there, because the people always go in there, you know, and then they will find it.
Well, it is possible the baby they found was not
That's
the Lindbergh baby.
no.
Yeah, so maybe it might be this man that claims he's the son.
Oh, there's another one. He came to my house, he looks an awful lot like it.
Oh, I can imagine a lot of people surfaced and said they were Lindbergh's son, yeah. But there's some possibility that this new one, is it up in Maine, they found somebody's contacting Attorney Brian?
No, this was long ago, before I knew Mr. Brian. Yeah. I met him.
I hope you and Mr. Brian are going to write a book together, are you? I thought so.
There will be a lot of surprises when you would read my book. What I've been through.
Well, how about this man that wrote this book, The Airman and the Carpenter?
Oh, I
know
know
him.
him.
He's contacting you too.
He's a very well-known in England. His wife was played in the theater, in the red shoe or red slippers or something.
Red shoes?
Oh, do you know the name? What's the name?
Marin.
No. Theater name. He told me 2 weeks ago he was in the team, yeah, and he called me and said that he were how I was, you know. So yeah, he was in my house.
Did he interviewed you quite a bit before he wrote the book?
Yeah, he had a documentary.
Oh, this, Joe, I guess this was the history.
But we thank all of you for coming.
Thank
We
you
really do.
very much.
This is very kind of you. We thank you for the flowers and your concern for her. She's a wonderful lady.
Are you going to print this anyplace?
Yeah, we can. We're going to have copies of that. We had 70 or 80 yesterday, but they were gobbled up by the media and toured.
Would they be available in your office if we take
Yeah.
them?
Yeah, we can make copies available if you'd be interested. Just give me a
I
call.
can't wait for your book. I guess that's going to come out pretty soon, right?
So much sooner.
No, soon, yeah.
Thinking about it.
Maybe when you can name the kidnapper.
Yeah.
Is there anything which anyone on the campus here can do to help you?
All right, what you on the campus can do is to...
Write letters to the president and what you think.
Not the president. This is a state case.
To
To the New Jersey legislature and to the governor's office in New
Yeah.
Jersey. That's what you can do.
What
And
you
if-
think about it.
And if you do send letters asking them to recognize that Richard Hauptman here at Fair Trial was innocent, so we should straighten this out. I wish if you or anyone else would send, whatever you send, you'll send a copy to me just so I know that you got it.
What I was thinking, maybe if you could come up with some form letter, or maybe we could come up with some form letters and get a lot of people on campus just to sign them.
That
and
would
send
be wonderful. That would be wonderful. If you call me sometime, I'd be glad to work out something with you on it, because that would be very helpful. That's what we need. We don't want your money. We don't want people's money. We need your support and concern.
That's what they did in Australia. A man wrote to me from Sydney, Australia, and then they sent their names and sent it all pictures.
Mrs. Hauptman, isn't this amazing? It's a Hearst newspaper. After all these years. May I see that article? And I don't think you've even looked at this one, Mrs. Hauptman. This is today's. This is November the 20th. It's a picture of you with Richard's testifying yesterday with Richard's picture behind you.
And that's a picture who had my husband convicted before he went to
Several times.
He wrote all those lies every day.
And Mrs. Hauptman, this starts out, Anna Hauptman's bright blue eyes brimmed with tears. And, yes. And beamed with joy Wednesday as a judge found reason to believe Bruno Richard Hauptman might have been innocent when he was convicted and executed 50 years ago for the kidnapping of the infant son of aviator hero Charles Lindbergh. Isn't that wonderful?
are usually successful.
He was a good man.
I wish there was more we could do to get him not to come up.
I know they never looked up. I would very nice person.
Thank you
Many
all.
more years, many more years.
Very kind.
Thank you.
She's a real gal.
Good morning, Mother. Yes, see.
We talked about it,
And then
but
I
it's a long
shot you
shot.
all
She
day.
recommended me trying
And
a
then
public
in the
defender in
evening
another
they
county.
take her
She
home.
goes
I'm trying to
home.
work
Oh,
my
she's
way
well
into it,
cared
because
for.
I had a
Oh,
problem
yes.
on 40, I had
So,
problems
but she
early.
misses you now.
First, an older
Maybe she
candidate
does, yeah.
coming to it.
Are you traveling? Are you doing a fair amount of traveling now?
Not no, but I'm always active. I go to with the church. I am doing things there. Then I go to the senior citizen, and we make things there. You know, I crochet, make things.
Yeah.
And ladies, like for all the ladies, you know, in a home.
I saw an ad today
For
for I think
Christmas,
Madeira or
and
something.
then we give it to them.
I'll get
You
in
know,
touch with them.
they always,
Yeah,
you know, when
I
you
don't
roll,
have any
we
problem
always
with
have cold feet,
Gold.
you know. And
I
then
was just
we
an
put it
okay
down
student,
in the
just,
bed,
I
give
did
you
strong.
warm,
That's
you know.
nice. Well, I have cold feet all the time.
Yes,
It gets
I'm
very
always
cold.
wearing
It's
two
a
pairs of
little
socks.
colder back east.
I definitely would.
I think I'm real sharp, but
What
that's about as far. And
What county do you live in?
In
worked in the consumer electronics business, selling,
outside
training salespeople, and I was a buyer for Pacific Stereo, big chain,
My
and now I sell wholesale
father did nothing, but I bought a house
But I
there.
have some presence in terms of on my rattle, but generally I can
Where
persuade
in
people.
Germany?
When I
think that if I got, if I
retired,
if
my
somebody
check
could
was $68.
application.
So you know, then I went back to work 3 days.
Okay,
You can always quit.
right. Like you say though, the nice thing is
Now
that there are a
everything
lot of
looks
people
bright.
who need
Yes,
help.
that's
Currently
right.
I'm doing
This morning when that man came and
Rights
showed me
Clinic
that
and an
paper,
unemployment
you
law
know,
clinic.
it's not
Getting a lot
really
of
a
interviewing
court,
experience,
you know,
helping
but
a lot of-
it
there's a
shows
lot
that
of,
people are interested
working
and
people who
believe
seem
in
to need
us,
help
you
these
know,
days.
and that makes me
And they're,
feel,
the
I
nice
said,
thing is they're
thank
not,
God I
it's not a
cried,
life or
and
death
I said,
situation.
thank God that
So
I see
they're,
now
usually they can't
you
find any
really
help at all, so you
waited
sure
long, but
you're
now you
certainly
do
don't have to worry
something
about
for
your
us.
skills.
And I told
That's the
them
thing
in
about
Jersey,
this,
I
your
said,
kind
I
of work
don't
is
want
that
any
you're
more.
really putting,
All I
you're putting
want
your,
is
absolute
my
sense that
husband.
that you know you hold a lot of, you hold
But I told my
somebody's
son,
life in your hands,
always
it's
carry
it's
your
a big
head high, don't
responsibility.
be ashamed. And if anybody would make a remark,
It was neat, this is a neat,
yes,
sorry.
good job for the state in Pennsylvania.
What does he do?
It's construction work.
We're not right now,
Good.
And see, when the trucks come in and deliver the material,
we don't have a need now.
for the street, if it's a street or a bridge or something, he has to check and measure down if it meets the requirements, you know. I did another note in Lucy's hands. Yes, and
We gave it to you, great.
and he was 2 years in the army too.
Oh, really?
Does he remember much?
It was more accentuated tonight with the cold
his
and I'm stopped up.
No, he was only 9 months old.
Nice.
So is this kind of the research project you're doing, or is it your business? So
That's just as well that he was spared that.
paid or something.
No, it has nothing to do with money because I've spent a lot of money on this case.
Yeah.
But, you know, it involves justice, clearing somebody's name, and the fact that if we're successful,
But it's
make
so
people
different
run
now,
for
the
it. So
atmosphere, I can feel it.
this case is,
When did you begin to feel hope?
How soon do you?
When did you begin to feel more hopeful?
When Mr. Bryan came in my life in
In
1981.
1987.
But I always hope that when, as we all grow older, those people from that time, all the time, you
Dealing with the
know,
lawyers, I've been
and I
working at firms.
I pray to
But you're
God
not
and
in
I
school.
say, God,
Yeah, I'm in school and work on my.
do something. You know it. You saw us drive home that night. You know my
Yeah,
husband was
so
innocent.
he was
Doctor
not
was
It's not a
innocent.
normal
Do
kind of
something.
subject.
Yeah,
But what
and
could
sell-
I do?
sell
I
them
had
to
not
see a lawyer like you.
hire a lawyer. I
I'm so
didn't.
glad. Yeah,
I had
I'm so
nothing to
glad
show.
someone's doing
They
something
had
like
everything in
that.
their files.
They changed the image of the
But
lawyer.
I always hope
I don't
that
think very much
one of
lawyers.
them,
But most
when he
most
dies, you
lawyers
know, we would say,
seem to
well,
lack
I'm
concern.
soon I'm dying,
Right.
maybe with
So
cancer, so
was-
that
I
they
mean, we
would say,
get to make money.
well, I
You
Yeah.
don't
know
have to take advantage of it.
the truth. That was
So I'm
my
really.
hope that long, but then when we saw
Yeah.
They took a different form.
Hauptman, now that you have the roses in hand and Dr. and Mrs. Rosenthal are here. Yeah, and we're going to go have a little coffee with them. And
Why
with
don't you come to our home?
Pat, Monica, why don't we go have a little quick cup of coffee at Rosenthal's, and then we'll go.
Let me get one quick.
Oh, thank you very much.
My name is Donna, by the way. My name is Donna.
Hey, Don.
And when I get the pictures to do, I want to mail you some.
Okay, fine. We'll do.
Okay.
Thank you very much
Okay,
for
nice
coming
to meet
tonight.
both of you.
It was our pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Okay.
Thanks for caring.
Okay.